Milo Devereux had always considered himself an average guy. He wasn't tall enough to stand out in a crowd, nor short enough to be ignored. He was average at everything: average height, average weight, average face, even average intelligence. Life had its little humdrum moments, sure. But for the most part, it was a string of monotonous days, and Milo was fine with it. He'd always believed in the subtle power of blending in, of staying just beneath the radar. Who needed the spotlight anyway? Then, one Thursday afternoon, he found himself hurtling through the air, like a discarded doll tossed by some unseen giant, after being hit by a car in a crosswalk. He didn't see it coming, not that he could have done anything about it. 1 second, he was crossing with the light, minding his own business, and the next, bam. A white sedan slammed into him, sending him flying like a ragdoll. The world spun in that weird slow-motion moment that comes before impact, and then everything went dark. The next thing Milo knew, he was awake, staring up at the cloudy sky. He could feel a strange sort of tingling beneath his skin. No pain. No bruising. His body didn't even feel battered, which was absurd considering how hard he'd been hit. But that wasn't the weirdest part. The weirdest part was that everything was different, not just his body, but the very air around him felt strange. He had a strange, sudden clarity, as if something had shifted inside him. His head was pounding, but it wasn't the kind of headache you'd get from a collision. It was deeper, more primal, like his body was trying to understand what had just happened. Milo sat up slowly. His legs were fine. His arms were fine. Everything was intact, in fact, better than fine. He ran his fingers over his skin. It felt smoother, almost softer than before. He didn't have a scratch on him. No blood. No bruises. Just a clean slate where a moment ago, he should have been broken. His first instinct was to laugh. Well, that was an overreaction, he muttered to himself. Maybe it was a miracle. He'd read somewhere that some people survive crashes like this, though they usually end up with some traumatic injury. But this? This was something else. That it was only later, after he'd gotten to his feet and limped to a nearby bench, that he noticed the small, iridescent patch of scales growing near his left elbow. At first, he thought it was dirt or maybe some residue from the crash. But when he touched it, it felt like smooth, cool metal, not skin. He stared at it for a long time, unable to decide whether he was hallucinating or had somehow become a subject in one of those bizarre genetic experiments that you hear about in conspiracy theory documentaries. But as far as he could tell, there was no sign of cameras or any other evidence of a scientific breakthrough gone wrong. His hand trembled as he wiped the scales with his sleeve. They didn't budge. He leaned closer, squinting. What the hell? He whispered to himself. He stared for a while longer, half expecting the scales to vanish, but they stayed there, like a stubborn smudge on a clean surface. When nothing more happened, he shrugged it off. Maybe it was some weird side effect of the accident. Maybe it would go away. That night, as Milo lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what had happened, he noticed something else. A sharp pain ran down his spine, and he jolted upright. The pain was so intense, so raw, it felt like his body was breaking apart. He gritted his teeth, clutching his bed sheets in desperation as the pain increased. It felt like his bones were shifting, rearranging. Sweat drenched his forehead. The sensation was almost alive, like something inside him was growing. After what felt like an eternity, the pain began to subside. Milo lay back against his pillow, gasping for breath. He hadn't noticed it before, but his fingers felt different. His left pinky was longer than it had been earlier in the day. And when he moved his hands, it felt like they had more dexterity than he remembered. He immediately checked the mirror, sitting up slowly. At first, everything seemed normal, but then he noticed it. There, on his hand, was the unmistakable extra appendage, an additional finger, curling out from the side of his right hand. It was a soft, pinkish hue, just like his skin, but it was undeniably there, just like the scales on his elbow. "Okay, I've officially lost it," Milo muttered, rubbing his eyes that he didn't sleep much that night. The next few days were a blur. Milo didn't know how to process what was happening to him. He kept hoping it was some kind of bizarre dream, but each time he woke up, his body was somehow different. A small patch of feathers sprouted from his shoulder on the second morning. By the third day, an extra toe appeared on his left foot. He could hardly keep track of the changes. It was like his body was transforming at an alarming rate. And the worst part? The more it changed, the less he felt like himself. He could still recognize his face in the mirror, but the body staring back at him seemed foreign. He wasn't just healing from his injuries, his body was evolving. When he went to the grocery store, he could feel people staring at him. Some looked away quickly when their eyes landed on his arm, where a small wing had begun to form, delicate and feathery, like the first sign of a bird's growth. Others outright pointed, whispering under their breath. A few kids even asked if he was a superhero, which made him chuckle in an effort to shrug off the discomfort. But the most unnerving part was the way he started feeling. The more his body changed, the more aware he became of things he hadn't noticed before. He could hear high-pitched sounds that no one else seemed to pick up. Colors seemed brighter, more vivid. His senses were sharper. It was like he was developing entirely new ways of perceiving the world around him. He couldn't help but wonder if this was part of the process, healing, evolving, becoming something beyond human. It wasn't long before Milo began to suspect that something much more sinister was at play. His rapid mutations weren't just random. They were systematic. Each new change, each additional organ, each extra appendage, felt like part of a larger design, one that had been carefully engineered. But by whom? And why him? Desperate for answers, Milo visited the hospital. The doctors ran tests, scratching their heads at the results. His body was healing at an accelerated rate, far beyond normal human capacity. His cells were regenerating at an exponential rate, but what was most troubling was the discovery of new genetic markers, signs of mutations that were nowhere in the human genome. It was like his DNA was rewriting itself, turning into something new entirely. Dr. Erica Huang, a leading expert in genetic evolution, suggested that his body was undergoing a process never seen before. It wasn't just healing, it was evolving. "Milo, you're becoming something else," she said, her voice shaking as she delivered the diagnosis. "Something that's never existed on Earth before." He could only stare at her, his mind spinning. What was happening to him? Why was it happening? Was this a gift or a curse? As the days passed, Milo's condition only worsened, or rather, evolved, depending on your perspective. His body was becoming increasingly alien. His wings grew larger, sprouting from his back, stretching until they nearly touched the floor. His fingers had elongated into slender, almost graceful shapes, while the scales on his skin seemed to spread and grow more intricate. Milo felt like a stranger in his own flesh. It wasn't long before scientists and news outlets caught wind of his story. People were fascinated. Some even came to him with the hope of studying him, making him the subject of their experiments. He felt like an animal in a cage, his every move scrutinized by eager eyes. The more they poked and prodded, the more they learned, but the more Milo felt like he was slipping away from who he once was. In one of the most terrifying moments, Milo had to leave his apartment. The local news had started broadcasting stories about a mutant man who could heal faster than any human alive, and soon, everyone wanted a piece of him. The scientists, the ones who were supposed to be studying him, didn't seem to care about his autonomy anymore. They just saw him as a freak, a specimen to be analyzed, dissected, and understood. Milo knew he had to get away, but he had no idea where to go. His body was evolving at a rapid pace. The world wasn't ready for what was happening to him. And neither was he. Milo didn't know where to go, but he couldn't stay in the apartment anymore. Not with the news outlets tracking his every move, not with the scientists circling him like vultures, eager to get a closer look at what he had become. Even in the quiet of his apartment, he could feel the buzz of the outside world pushing in. It was like his body had become a magnet for attention, and the more he tried to hide from it, the more the world found him. He packed a small bag, just a few changes of clothes, some money, and his passport. He couldn't remember when his apartment had started to feel more like a prison than a home, but now, it was all too much. He shoved the door open and stepped into the hallway, the weight of his mutations dragging on him like a shadow. His feet felt strange. His toes, too many of them now, shifted and pressed into the floor as he walked, as if his body was adjusting to the new terrain beneath him. His wings, too large to fit comfortably through the doorway, stretched out behind him as he maneuvered around the hall. There was a moment, just before he left, when he paused and glanced at the full-length mirror in the corner of the room. He didn't recognize the person looking back at him. It was still his face, mostly, but his skin had taken on a pale, almost otherworldly sheen. His eyes were no longer the brown they once were, they had shifted into a hue of violet that seemed to shimmer in the light. He could no longer tell if the reflection was a man or something else entirely. The hallway was quiet, too quiet. He moved quickly, his footsteps echoing in the empty building. The last thing he needed was someone catching him in this state, especially with everything that was happening. He had no idea where he was going, he just knew he had to leave. There was no one he could trust anymore. Everyone who had once been in his life had either distanced themselves out of fear or curiosity, wanting to study him instead of just being around him. He was alone. Milo ended up in a small motel outside of the city, far enough away from his apartment and the buzzing chaos of the media circus. He couldn't afford to stay long, but it was enough to get a few hours of rest. The room was nothing special, just a dull, gray space with a flickering TV and a bed that looked like it had seen better days. But for now, it was his sanctuary. It was the only place where he could hide from the world. As he sat on the edge of the bed, he felt the familiar discomfort of his body shifting again. It was happening more frequently now, as if his cells were constantly on the move, constantly changing. He could feel the energy inside him building up, like a storm waiting to break. It was becoming harder to control. The changes weren't just physical. He could feel his mind altering too, slipping away from the person he used to be. His thoughts were sharper, faster, but also fragmented, disconnected from the past. He didn't even know who he was anymore, not in the way he had once understood himself. Was he Milo Devereux, the quiet, average guy who worked in software development? Or was he something else? Something that didn't belong to this world. He didn't have answers, and every time he tried to understand what was happening, it felt like his mind was slipping further away. That night, as he lay on the bed, trying to ignore the sharp pangs of discomfort running through his body, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen. The number was unfamiliar. He didn't want to answer, but something inside him told him to pick up. "Hello?" he said, his voice hoarse. "Milo?" It was a woman's voice, calm, but with an edge of urgency. "This is Dr. Erica Huang." His pulse quickened. He had almost forgotten about her. She was the one who had first confirmed that his body was undergoing genetic mutations, that he wasn't just healing, but evolving. He'd stopped returning her calls after the last session, when she had started asking questions he wasn't ready to answer. He wasn't ready to let anyone close, not after everything that had happened. "I'm sorry to bother you," she continued. "But we need to talk. It's about your condition. There's something you need to know." He hesitated, his fingers gripping the phone tightly. "What do you want, Dr. Huang?" She paused, like she was considering her next words carefully. "Milo, your condition is more than just an anomaly. What's happening to you isn't just random. It's part of something bigger. A project, a series of experiments." "What kind of experiments?" Milo interrupted, his voice rising. He didn't want to hear any more. He had no interest in being part of someone's project. He was already too far gone for that. "Please," she said quickly, "just hear me out. I know you've been avoiding us, but we're trying to help you. There's something we haven't told you. You're not just a victim of some freak accident. This is the result of years of research, decades of studies. You're the next step in human evolution. Milo sat up, his mind racing. What are you talking about? Am I some kind of experiment? His heart pounded. His hands trembled. I don't want any part of it. I know, Dr. Huang said softly. I know. But you need to understand, Milo. You're not alone in this. There are others like you, people who've gone through similar transformations. They're calling it Project Genesis. It's been running in the background for years, and you've become a part of it without even realizing it. Milo's blood ran cold. He didn't want to believe it, but the pieces were starting to fit together. The mutations. The rapid evolution. The sense of being different, like he was no longer a part of the world he had once known. I'm not your guinea pig, he spat, the words bitter in his mouth. You don't get to control me. We're not trying to control you, she said quickly. But you need to understand that the changes you're experiencing are not just physical. They're also mental. The scientists behind the project, enough. Milo shouted, his voice echoing through the tiny motel room. He slammed the phone down, his breath ragged. He could feel his chest tightening, like the air itself was being drawn out of him. The energy inside him was swirling again, like it was building up for something. Something big. Something he couldn't control. He stood up quickly, pacing the room. He needed to get out. He needed to escape this, whatever it was becoming. But where could he go? Who could he trust? As he moved toward the door, he felt a sharp pain in his side. His body lurched as his skin began to ripple. Something inside him was growing. He could feel it. His spine ached as new, sharp ridges began to form along his back. His wings twitched, and his hands stretched as though they were becoming claws. Milo gasped for air, clutching his chest. His reflection in the mirror across the room was no longer just a man. He wasn't a man anymore. He was becoming something else entirely. His transformation wasn't just physical. It was in every fiber of his being. His DNA was no longer that of a human. It was something beyond. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Milo froze, his body trembling. His heart pounded in his chest. The knock came again, louder this time. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't let anyone see him like this. He was no longer who he had been just a few days ago. He was something different, something dangerous. But before he could make a decision, the door burst open. The door flew open, and for a moment, Milo thought he had imagined it, the sharp, insistent knock. But no, it was real, and standing there in the doorway was Dr. Huang, her face pale but determined, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something else, something like urgency. He didn't know how she had found him. His first instinct was to run, to take off before anyone could get a good look at him, but there was something in her expression, something that stopped him from turning away. Milo, she said softly, stepping into the room. You need to listen to me. Milo stepped back instinctively, his hand reaching for the door as if he could slam it shut, but his body betrayed him. He was already changing again. His wings, tugged at his back, stretching painfully as if they were fighting against him. His fingers flexed uncontrollably, the extra appendages curling like talons. His skin rippled, and for a brief moment, his reflection in the cracked motel mirror looked like a creature out of some dark legend, something monstrous, not human at all. Dr. Huang stepped closer, her gaze locked on him, but there was no revulsion in her eyes, just worry, something deeper. She didn't flinch when his features flickered, shifting, becoming something he could hardly recognize. You don't have much time, she said quickly. They know where you are, Milo. They've already located this motel. You have to trust me. I can help you. He stared at her, his chest tightening. Who is they? His voice came out in a harsh rasp, almost unrecognizable. Is this some kind of sick joke, Doctor? Am I some kind of of experiment to you?" His words were sharp, defensive, but the panic creeping up on him was undeniable. He was being hunted, and there was no one left to help him. "Please, Milo, just listen." Dr. Huang's voice cracked slightly, the urgency mounting. "You're right, this wasn't your choice. None of it was. But I know the people who have been behind it. And I know how to stop it. You don't have to be a part of their plans anymore. There's still a chance for you." His heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to believe her, but the pain was unbearable. His body was changing too quickly, faster than he could process, and every time he looked at her, he felt the growing sense that maybe she wasn't the one he should trust. Maybe the ones who had started all of this were closer than they seemed. "Stop," Milo said, shaking his head, his hands trembling as the talons at the ends of his fingers dug into the skin of his palms. "Just stop. You're part of this. You helped make me, this." His words came out in a low growl as his voice deepened. He could feel it, his mind was becoming sharper, clearer, but also more detached. He wasn't the same person who had first walked into this motel room. Every second he spent in this new form, he was slipping further away from the life he once had. Dr. Huang's eyes softened with regret. "I never meant for this to happen, Milo. But you're not alone. You're not a freak. You're not a monster. You're evolving, yes. But there's a reason for it, and I can help you find out what that reason is. You have to come with me." The words echoed in his mind, but Milo could hardly focus. His body was thrumming with an energy he couldn't control. The wings pressed against the walls of the room, scraping against the chipped wallpaper. The muscles in his arms tightened as he clenched his fists, trying to hold himself together. He wanted to believe her. He did. But he could hear the whir of engines in the distance, the sound of approaching vehicles. He could sense the shift in the air, the inevitable encroachment of people who would try to take him, study him, turn him into some kind of weapon. He didn't want to be anyone's project anymore. "I don't need anyone's help," he said through clenched teeth, his voice rough, but there was something final in his words. "I'm done being experimented on." Milo turned, his legs unsteady beneath him, and began moving toward the door, his steps sharp and quick. He could feel the weight of his wings, the unnatural stretch of his fingers. He could feel the pressure of it all, the terrifying reality of his body being transformed, stretched in ways he hadn't asked for and couldn't undo. "Where are you going?" Dr. Huang's voice called after him, but it was too late. He was already halfway to the door. "I'm not your test subject," he repeated, opening the door with a force that made the frame creak. As he stepped out into the night, the cool air hit him like a slap to the face. The stars above seemed so far away, so distant, as if they were part of another world. He felt like he was a part of something bigger now, something alien to the Earth he had once known. But the sense of freedom was short-lived. The headlights of a truck flashed in the distance. He could see them now, the people who had been hunting him. He could feel their presence. They were close. Too close. Milo turned his back on the motel, his wings flaring wide, the muscles of his back protesting as he pushed them out, his chest heaving with the sudden weight of it. His feet lifted off the ground, the air rushing past him as he soared into the night sky. His mind was clear now, his senses sharp. He had never been more aware of everything around him, of the wind rushing through his feathers, the sound of the engine in the distance, the feel of the world far below him. He wasn't just running away anymore. He was free, but freedom didn't come without its costs. He soared high, higher than he ever thought he could, until the world below was a blurry mosaic of city lights. He could still hear the vehicles racing to follow him, but it didn't matter now. He was no longer part of that world. The moment he had taken flight, he had become something different. Something other. He could feel the eyes on him even as he flew, the eyes of the world, the eyes of the people who had created him. But he was no longer theirs to control. He was becoming something beyond their reach. He was becoming something new. Milo didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if he was meant to be the next step in human evolution or if he was a mistake, a miscalculation in a long-forgotten experiment. But one thing was certain, his evolution was not something he could stop, and it was not something anyone could control. He wasn't going to let anyone use him again. As he flew into the dark night, the stars shining cold and distant above him, he could only hope that wherever this strange new path was leading him, it would be his own. And for the first time since all of this had begun, he felt a small, bitter smile tug at the corners of his mouth. He had escaped. He was free.